Now, before you put it up, Garrett, Charlie Baker, NCAA president, mentioned the NCAA women's basketball tournament, which is in its final season of a $34 million deal with ESPN to broadcast all Division I championships other than football and men's basketball. He is saying that there's a chance it could be worth up to $112 million in 2 years, which is something that's interesting because then I have this note. So LSU just had an incredible year. Kim Mulkey makes probably the second most money, Gino Auriemma, and I don't have the figures. Muffet McGraw used to be a part of this conversation. Tara at Stanford, but she earns $2.5 million. They generate, this is LSU women's basketball, which is across the board elsewhere, generate less than $1 million in revenue. Now, they had great attendance. At Baylor, they had great attendance. The business of LSU women's basketball was the top of the top. The deficit was nearly $7 million in 2022. That's not this year, but last year. The NCAA, you've talked about Shannon here, is the only business that a CEO gets 2 times the total revenue. However, athletes only get about 9% of the total labor. Now, what he was saying here is not that Kim Mulkey's overpaid, but that they lose dollars. We knew that at Baylor, women's basketball at Baylor was losing many times over $6 million or around $6 million a year. This new TV deal might, I don't know if it means they're going to make revenue or be revenue in the plus, but that this new deal might really help a sport that otherwise is known as a non-revenue sport.
I think he's also very much saying that it's ridiculous that for a sport that operates money, Kim Mulkey's probably making as much as she does, and Angel Reese is making scratch.
Right.
I think that's what he's saying as much as anything. That's a pro athlete tweet. That's a pro. You're operating a $7 million loss, but Kim Mulkey's making like 2.5, 3, and the athletes are getting probably very little of that.
Well, like you said, about 9% of it.
9% of that. So I don't know. That's how I read it, Paul.
That's how I read it. And look, there's a lot of things that can happen to fix the non-revenue sports. The biggest thing is that people have to show interest in them, going, watching, engaging with them. But I know that dollars spread only so thin, and like you can't sometimes things are going to work and sometimes things are going to not, or people, things come and go. I could move to England right now, and I know they had a team in the World Baseball Classic, and I could say, you know what, I'm going to make baseball work here. And they're like, you know what, we like football, soccer, that's what we like. We like when the NFL comes and plays a couple games a year. We're kind of into that. We have our own thing, but, please go back to America and stop telling me to like baseball. It's kind of the same way with non-revenue sports, and that's just not women's basketball and everything else. It's like we like football, we like men's basketball, we like a couple things in this country, and we're probably more diverse in our sports taste than most, but eventually the dollar just spreads a little too thin. I hope for women's basketball they get a better TV deal and get more people interested in going. Women have to go more, that's for sure. And if that starts happening, then that's great news.
I also think Charlie Baker is throwing out a sales pitch and speaking into existence that the women's tournament should draw that much money.
Strike while it's hot.
Yeah, and it's as hot as it's been. And to follow up on sort of my comments earlier just about the game itself and, what we saw and all of that, I do think it's a shame that by the end of it, so much of the talk was about, the interaction at the end, or it was about the officiating, and very little of it was about the actual game itself, which LSU pretty much controlled the entire time, and never really felt all that in doubt, especially, when you had some foul trouble on both sides. They still were able to have others step up, and Iowa not as much. But I do think that, to follow up on what I was saying about Mulkey and like how she's basically got just free reign and unlimited potential, you've got this star in Angel Reese. You've got the #1 recruiting class. And really what I was speaking to as far as like the size of LSU and the fan base and the SEC and all that, it does feel like there's sort of a flashpoint, right, where if you are going to try and take women's basketball to another level, I don't think that you get that reaction if she's coaching Baylor yesterday. I think that she definitely didn't tap out what she could do or what she could win. But I think, like, in order to take women's basketball to another level, and maybe you guys totally disagree on this, I do think that maybe the move to LSU is what does that ultimately. I think that's brand that gets more attention. I think if Baylor wins that game yesterday, everybody's just like ho-hum and goes on about their business. Kim Mulkey's great. She did it again. That's number 4. But the fact that she did it, and there was this in some ways very racially charged. It became the talk on social media, and then there was just the sides that was just the regular old sports fans that were talking trash, and that all got very ugly. But it was trending everywhere that you looked, and Angel Reese was trending, whether it's for a fight or the argument or the point at the ring, or because of just what she did throughout the tournament, throughout the year. You had all the talk about you had just all this talk, whether it was good or bad. It was talk, and I think that where she is now, she can kind of take this thing, or it's very timely to be where she is, where they can kind of take it to a level that I don't think if it stays status quo, we're talking about it reaching this next level.
It's their first ever national title. They've had they've had really good teams in the past. Women's basketball's biggest problem was 4 teams every year are going to win the national title.
Yeah.
And maybe 6. And now you have a new group of others, and she's at a big school.
It's a huge brand.
It's a huge following. It's the entire state. This
Yeah.
isn't like some small private school in Texas that's like the 4th or 5th wheel, depending on what you're looking at. I do think, the brand, the money behind them, the support is going to be, second to none. Like I said earlier, she could do absolutely no wrong there. And then you have like the tiff that turns into the unfortunately the biggest talking point, but it turns into probably the game being talked about far more than it was going to be talked about if it had just gone, 81-75, and that's the final, and there was no dust up. You don't want the dust up in every single game, obviously, but I just think that you're at a kind of a flashpoint, like I said, where maybe the right coach at the right place with the right star at the right time in the right environment. Maybe Charlie Baker's onto something. Maybe this is a turning point for the sport. Then again, maybe it's not. I don't know.
I think also that what South Carolina was coming back from a national title, they were unbeaten until they were beaten by Iowa. You have this star in Caitlin Clark who shoots the ball maybe as well as anyone you've ever seen who's played women's basketball at the collegiate level. So a lot of that. And it was a weekend that they ought to take advantage of if they possibly can. And there's some that still don't even know it was played. And yet
right.
There's also people that don't know the World Cup is going on.
You're right. But, Caitlin Clark and then South Carolina and Dawn Staley kind of being, her having comments in the post game that, we're not thugs and all that. Like, I know some of the stuff from this weekend definitely probably rubbed some people the wrong way. Just kind of like this is getting just too much trash talk or, too much pettiness or whatever. But just overall, as far as what the world goes for, impressions and hits and things like that, I think that they probably had as successful of a weekend as you could possibly have. Now,
polarizing.
Polarizing is definitely the proper word to use.
All right, one more thing is we come back and discuss